Welcome to the Nebraska Department of Education's Making It Stick Professional Development webinar series. I'm Dr. Michael Quinn, and I'll be your host for Module 2, Formative Assessment. Have you ever felt great about your content delivery, but unsure how or if it was being received by your students? This webinar will address your student retention concerns and help you check for understanding. The Formative Assessment webinar will take 35 minutes. Throughout this module, we built in some learner engagement activities to ensure your comprehension. When you see the pencil icon, you'll be asked to pause, reflect, engage, and write in your viewing guide. Feel free to stop, start, and rewind as needed. After you complete the module, we'll ask you a few quick questions to see if we've helped you meet the lesson's objectives. Let's get started. Here's our webinar's umbrella question. How can we use formative assessments to monitor student learning? Because we always want to make strong instructional decisions, increase the power of our assessments, and gather evidence of student learning. First, we'll identify the difference between formative and summative assessments. Second, we'll use one new formative assessment strategy. Third, we will measure a learning standard with a formative assessment. Finally, we'll help you analyze the quality of assessment activities using specific criteria. After this webinar, we hope you're able to define, recognize, and implement more formative assessments in your classroom practice. In the Core Instructional Model webinar, Module 1, we introduce the anatomy of a lesson. Let's take a minute to visit the anatomy of a lesson in a linear, time-allocated display. Today's webinar will discuss how we can use formative assessments throughout our lessons. Remember that we are monitoring and adjusting our instruction 100% of the time. Teachers must be present in the moment, collecting formative data, and using it to make real-time adjustments as needed. We will begin by activating our own relevant knowledge. Either by yourself or in a group, let's take some time to digest and reflect on your ability to monitor student learning. Consider the following question. What kinds of evidence do you currently gather to monitor students' depth of knowledge? For your example of evidence, you can list strategies, examples, or an overall approach. The three big ideas from the core instructional model are a relentless focus on learning for all students, a collaborative culture and collective effort to support student and adult learning, and a result-focused orientation to improve practice and drive continuous improvement. Then answer the following. What makes it so hard to get under the hood and assess students' depth of knowledge? Please pause the video for a moment and write down your answers to the questions in your viewing guide. Press play when you're ready to resume. We'll begin with a few working definitions from Transformative Assessment by W. James Popham. Summative assessment is measurement of a student's knowledge or skill for the purposes of verification. Formative assessment is measurement of a student's knowledge or skill for the purposes of adjusting ongoing teaching and learning to improve students' achievement of intended instructional outcomes. Formative assessment is a process rather than a product, like a particular test. It is used by both teachers and students. Formative assessment takes place during instruction and is used to provide assessment-based feedback to teachers and students. The function of this feedback is to help teachers and students make adjustments that will improve curricula and achievement. If you're viewing as a staff or PLC, feel free to pause the video to list examples of summative and formative assessments with your colleagues. Press play when you're ready to resume. Let's stop here for some active manipulation of the content. You've spent some time discussing examples of formative and summative assessment, but let's get more specific. Either by yourself or in a group, think about your own grade level or content area. Please pause the video for a moment and fill in the table in your viewing guide. If you're viewing as a staff or PLC, share your ideas with the group. Press play when you're ready to resume. Here's one example of a completed chart. Formative assessments are ongoing assessments, reviews, and observations in a classroom. Teachers use formative assessments to check on student understanding, adjust instructional methods, and provide students with feedback throughout the teaching and learning process. Formative assessment can be formal or informal, spur of the moment or pre-planned. Master teachers pause and check for understanding every 15 minutes. Summative assessments are typically used to evaluate the effectiveness of instructional programs and services at the end of an academic year or predetermined time. The goal of summative assessments is to judge student competency after an instructional phase is complete. In essence, formative assessments are the assessments for learning, and summative assessments are assessments of learning. Now that we've looked at the overarching differences between formative and summative assessments, let's get a bit more specific. Take a look at the example assessments in your viewing guide. Rate each as 1, strictly formative, 2, more formative than summative, 3, evenly split, 4, more summative, or 5, almost strictly summative. Then put them in order from most formative to most summative. Pause the video so you can complete this activity. Press play when you're ready to resume. The order is shown by grouping. The blue simply cannot possibly be used as summative assessments. They are both pre-assessments and would be asked purely to change teaching in the lesson or unit that follows. The green ones, too, are pretty much strictly formative, even though they are all ongoing assessment. The yellow ones could be somewhere in between, depending on how grading is handled, but generally still are formative. The orange ones are primarily summative, though they too can have a formative element, particularly if teachers allow students to fix mistakes so that they can continue to learn. The pink is nearly strictly summative. Which assessment types were difficult to rate, and why? As we plan for instruction, we need to strike the right balance between formative and summative assessments. This activity begins by asking you to reflect on the current practices in your individual classroom, or school as a whole. This will help you to be consciously competent. Please pause the video and consider, then estimate your school's balance. If possible, discuss and share with your colleagues. Press play when you're ready to resume. If you were able to discuss with your colleagues, I hope you had a productive conversation about finding the right balance. Were you able to reach a consensus about where the balance should be? All answers are correct. As consciously competent professionals, teachers need to make thoughtful decisions based on their own students. The balance will likely be very lopsided on the formative side. Just how lopsided will shift based on students' needs or where teachers are in their unit. The important part is being aware of how much teachers are using formative and summative assessments, and whether they're using the data to guide instruction. Let's be reflective about the teaching practices in our schools. Too often, we accept the answers of a few to serve as a check for understanding of all students. How do you check for understanding during a lesson? Everybody got that? Any questions from the group? Does that make sense? Okay. Can we move on? Are we good? How often do you either ask or hear the questions on the screen? Notice that these are all yes or no types of questions. Will the information gathered really help us know if students are ready to move on? If we really want to know if everybody got that, we need better tools for gathering that data. This slide shows two alternatives to asking whole group yes or no type questions. The first is using whiteboards so students can respond to a question and hold up their answers. This gives teachers a quick visual check for understanding and lets you know if students are ready to move on. The data collected can also be used to quickly group students based on the responses you see in the room. It doesn't have to be because answers were right or wrong. You could be polling for opinions and create groups for discussion. Self-assessment signals are also an easy way to take the temperature of the whole group. Thumbs up, down, or sideways if you're unsure. Let the teacher know if students got it or still need more time to process. Likewise, signal cards or a fist to 5 give you a quick visual assessment of students' understanding and encourage them to reflect on their learning process. Your viewing guide contains many more examples that you'll be able to review and discuss in just a moment. Either by yourself or in a group, read the list of strategies in your viewing guide. Pause the video for a moment and mark your strategies using the symbols on screen in your viewing guide. If you're attending with colleagues and time permits, discuss the strategies with your group members as well. Press play when you're ready to resume. The final piece of the puzzle is considering the level of rigor of our assessments. Are we just scratching the surface, or are we pushing our students to deeper levels of understanding? To help assess our assessments, we can look to Webb's Depth of Knowledge, a framework that describes a hierarchy and provides vocabulary for analyzing the complexity of objectives and tasks. Let's take a look at each of the 4 levels in a bit more detail. As we move from level 1, recall, to level 4, extended thinking, we are asking students to stretch beyond basic reproduction or even application. We're asking them to engage in more sophisticated analysis and to solve problems by integrating knowledge from multiple sources. Your viewing guide contains more detail describing the 4 levels. Please take some time to read, digest, and, if possible, discuss. Press play when you're ready to resume. Let's look at a classroom example to better understand depth of knowledge. As we go through each, determine which depth of knowledge level applies. Note that activity D, being so similar to B, gets knocked down because students are reproducing a skill that they already learned and practice, although the context does change a bit. And that's what level 2 is, application to another context. C might be better placed after activity A, as it gives students a chance to build up the depth of knowledge levels. Creating from scratch assessments is unnecessary when upping the rigor in our classrooms. Sometimes the right question can provide just enough push to help students think a bit more deeply. Consider the questions on the screen. Why is it? What is it like? How do you know? What can you do with it? What if it was different? What else do you know? Now take a look at a few possible follow-up questions. These types of probing questions are hitting the depth of knowledge levels 3 and 4. They are asking students to draw conclusions and represent knowledge in a variety of ways. These questions are pushing students to cite evidence and asking them to evaluate the source. Just remember, a rigorous question doesn't always elicit a rigorous response. Teachers will have to model and set expectations for students as they engage in academic conversations. Pause the video for a moment and consider how you can incorporate these types of questions into your classroom discussions. How can you encourage students to ask each other these types of questions? How will you model and support students as they craft their responses both verbally and in writing? Think about how often students in your class or school are asked to stretch to depth of knowledge levels 3 and 4. Then consider what the ideal would look like. Take a moment to fill out the chart in your viewing guide. Note that your entire array of assessments counts, even questions asked in class for formative assessment purposes. Press play when you're ready to resume. Hopefully, you've had some time to think about your own classrooms. Notice that the first 2 levels should be regular and multiple times a day. Depth of knowledge level 3 should happen daily, but it would depend on your goals. Level 4 takes time and therefore happens less frequently. Per unit, many teachers have only 1 level 4 activity. Here is a list of some helpful tips as you create your assessments. A healthy mix of all 4 levels will give you a more complete picture of students' understanding. Take a moment to go back to the formative assessment activity that you created. To summarize our learning, we can think of the relationship between assessing and teaching as a cycle. Formative assessment helps us determine what students know. That, in turn, leads to good teaching decisions. The cycle repeats with additional assessment, which could be summative if we know we need to move on. Before we end our webinar, let's use one of the formative assessment strategies to synthesize your own learning. If you were using this in the classroom, the sentences can be collected as an exit ticket so you can quickly gather data on all students and use the information to prepare for the next lesson. Use the words from the word bank to write a single sentence in your viewing guide that demonstrates your understanding of formative assessment. If you're viewing in a PLC, be sure to share your sentences with the group. Press play when you're ready to resume. Either by yourself or in a group, let's take some time to create a new formative assessment activity. Choose one assessment strategy with a star from your original list that you would like to try out soon. Use the strategy to create an activity for students. As you're planning the activity, keep the following pointers in mind. Alignment. Does the activity require students to engage with the learning objective and/or standard? Substance. Will students have to do something substantial with the topic? Clarity. Are the directions and expectations as clear as possible? Evidence of learning. Does the activity call for students to provide evidence, interpretations, or reasons? Will the activity provide ample evidence of what students know? Feedback. Can the assessment provide students with information about their successes and needs? Refer to the graphic organizer in your viewing guide. Evaluate the level of rigor. What is the depth of knowledge level? Is there a way to boost the depth of knowledge if it's below level 4? Repeat the process, taking one of your X strategies that looked unappealing or irrelevant to you, and tailor it to one that you'd like to try, bringing it up to a depth of knowledge level 4. What changes did you make to transform your strategy into a level 4 activity? Please pause the video for a moment and write down your 2 new strategies and your answers to the questions in your viewing guide. Press play when you're finished. Which star strategy did you pick? Which X strategy did you pick? What did you adjust to increase the rigor? How do we know if your 2 new activities have at least a depth of knowledge level 3? See what we did there? That brings us to the end of our webinar. Please take a moment to fill out our brief survey by visiting the link provided. Thank you for learning with us today.